The alarm tore through the station before I had even zipped my bag. Red light flooded my quarters. Not the soft amber warning I had grown used to during my 2 years on Vale Prime, but the deep red that meant something had gone wrong in a way that could not be undone with an apology. I dropped the bag and grabbed my jacket instead of finishing the packing. 2 years of my life were folded into that single case, and none of it mattered if the ceiling came down on my head in the next 10 minutes. A voice crackled through the station speakers, speaking in the clipped, musical tone of the Vale language, followed by the translated version in my ear implant. Security breach detected in Docking Corridor 7. All personnel are to remain in place until cleared. Docking Corridor 7 was where my transport ship was waiting, the ship that was supposed to take me home in less than 5 hours. I stood there for a second, staring at the door, trying to decide whether staying in place was the smart choice or the kind of choice that gets a person killed while waiting politely for permission to run. Then someone pounded on my door. Not a chime, not a polite request for entry, a fist, hitting metal hard enough that I felt it in my chest. I opened it and found Vesa standing there, breathing fast, her pale blue eyes wide in a way I had never seen on her before. The Vale did not usually show fear on their faces. Their culture trained it out of them from childhood, the same way ours trains children to say please and thank you. But right now, standing in my doorway, Vesa looked like a person who had just watched something terrible and was still trying to process it. "You cannot go to the docking corridor," she said. I blinked at her. "Vesa, what is going on?" She stepped past me into my quarters without waiting for an invitation, which was its own kind of alarming, because in 2 years she had never once entered my room without formally requesting permission first. She turned to face me, and her hands were shaking, actual, visible shaking, in a body built by evolution and culture to never shake. "There is a device attached to the underside of your transport ship," she said. "It was placed there 4 hours ago. I only just confirmed it myself, because no one else would listen to me." My stomach dropped somewhere past the floor of the station and kept falling. "A device," I repeated. "You mean a bomb?" She did not flinch at the word the way her people usually did when confronted with anything blunt or ugly. She simply nodded once, sharp and certain. "Yes, a bomb. Time to detonate during your final departure sequence, when the ship is fully fueled and the docking clamps release." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The alarm kept flashing red across her face, across the wall behind her, across the small collection of human items I had packed away in boxes that now felt pointless. "Who would do this?" I finally asked. "There is a faction," she said. "Elders who believe our people have been changed too much, too quickly, by contact with yours. They call it contamination. They believe emotion is a weakness that your species has been spreading through us like a sickness, and they intend to end the treaty before it spreads any further." I thought of the treaty documents I had spent the last 2 years drafting, translating, defending in rooms full of Vale officials who looked at me like I was an experiment they had not yet decided whether to trust. I thought of every dinner, every late-night conversation, every small human moment I had allowed myself to share with people who did not know what to do with feelings, until slowly, carefully, some of them started to. And I thought of Vesa, standing across from me with fear plain on her face, breaking every rule of her upbringing just to warn me. "Why are you telling me this instead of station security?" I asked. Her jaw tightened. "I did tell them. 3 hours ago. They dismissed my concerns as emotional overreaction because I could not yet prove it with their approved methods. So I gathered the proof myself." She held up a small data device, no larger than a coin, its surface glowing faintly with recorded evidence. "I have been watching the corridor cameras since this morning, cross-referencing maintenance logs, tracking every person who entered that docking bay in the last 12 hours, she said. "I found the moment the device was placed. I found the person who placed it. And I came here the instant I was certain, because you are leaving in 5 hours and I could not let you walk onto that ship without knowing." The alarm cut off suddenly, replaced by a calmer voice announcing that the breach had been contained and personnel could resume normal movement. I did not trust it for a second. That announcement is wrong, Vesa said, reading my expression correctly. The device is still there. Someone higher up the chain does not want to panic before the treaty renewal vote tomorrow. They will quietly remove the device and quietly pretend nothing happened, and the people responsible will simply try again later, more carefully. I sat down on the edge of my half-packed crate, my mind racing faster than my heart, though my heart was doing a fairly impressive job of racing too. "So what do we do?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes that had nothing to do with bombs or treaties or factions of angry elders. "There is something I need to tell you first," she said, "something I have wanted to say for a long time and have been too afraid to, and I think, given everything happening right now, I may not get another chance if I wait any longer." My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the alarm still echoing faintly down the corridor outside. "Can I tell you something before you leave?" she asked. Her voice shook on the last word, the same way her hands had shaken when she first walked through my door. For a species that prided itself on control, on the careful management of every visible emotion, that small tremor in her voice hit me harder than the news of the bomb had. My heart was already racing from the danger. Now it was racing for an entirely different reason, and for a moment I could not tell which fear was louder, the one about the device attached to my ship, or the one about whatever she was about to say. "Vesa," I said carefully, "we might have 5 hours before that ship becomes a fireball. Are you sure now is the time?" She almost smiled, though it came out strained and uncertain, like a person trying out an expression they had only ever seen on someone else's face. "If I wait for a safer time," she said, "I am afraid I will never say it at all, and I have already decided that today, of all days, I am done being afraid." Outside my door, footsteps echoed down the corridor, fast and heavy, boots against metal, more than one set. Vesa's head snapped toward the sound before I even registered it, and whatever softness had crept into her expression vanished instantly, replaced by the same sharp alertness I imagined she used while tracking evidence through hours of security footage. "They know I came here," she whispered. "They must have tracked my movements too." I stood up fast, adrenaline shoving aside every other feeling in my body. "Who is they?" "The same people who placed the device," she said. "If they know I found it, they will not simply let me walk away and report it properly." The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside my door. I looked at Vesa, she looked at me, and in that single shared glance I understood two things with complete clarity. First, that we were both in immediate danger, more danger than either of us had faced in this posting so far. And second, that whatever she had been about to tell me, whatever confession had been building behind those wide blue eyes, was not going away. It was only being delayed by the emergency currently standing on the other side of my door, fists raised, about to knock. The knock came, sharp and official, 3 strikes against the metal door. Vesa grabbed my arm, her grip firmer than I expected from someone whose culture discouraged unnecessary touch. "Do not answer," she whispered. "There is a service corridor behind the storage panel in your closet. It connects to the lower maintenance levels. I used it once during an inspection tour. It is narrow, but it will get us away from here." I did not question how she knew the layout of my quarters that well. There was no time for questions that were not about survival. We moved fast, sliding the storage panel aside to reveal a narrow shaft, lit by a single strip of dim emergency lighting. The knock at the door became pounding, then a voice demanding entry in the formal tone Veil security used before they were authorized to force their way in. I climbed into the shaft first, then reached back to help Vesa follow, and for a moment her hand was in mine, small and cool and steady despite everything happening around us. We crawled through the narrow space as the door behind us gave way with a metallic crash. "They will search the room and find it empty," she said quietly as we moved. "It will buy us perhaps 10 minutes before they check the service access panels." 10 minutes to do what exactly? I asked. "Reach the lower archive level," she said. "I stored a complete copy of my evidence there, on an isolated terminal that is not connected to the main station network. If something happens to me, or to this device I am carrying, the copy will still exist. We crawled in silence for a while after that, the metal cold under my hands, my knees aching against the narrow floor of the shaft. I kept thinking about her words. If something happens to me, she had said it so plainly, like a fact rather than a fear, and it bothered me more than the bomb did. As we moved, my mind drifted back over the 2 years that had brought us to this moment, and I found myself remembering the small things, the details, that had built slowly into whatever this was between us. I remembered the first week of my posting, when Vesa had been assigned as my primary contact, and how she had studied me across the negotiation table with an expression I could not read, somewhere between curiosity and distrust. The Veil had encountered only a handful of other species before humanity arrived, and none of them behaved the way we did. We laughed too loudly. We touched each other during conversations, a hand on a shoulder, an arm around a friend. We cried, sometimes in public, without apparent shame. To the Veil, all of this looked like a species that had never learned to control itself. I remembered the day, 3 months into my posting, when a colleague of hers, an elder archivist named Corin, lost his research partner to a shuttle accident. Veil custom dictated that grief be processed alone, in private meditation, without display or comfort from others. I broke that custom without thinking, wrapping my arms around Corin in the middle of the archive hall when I found him standing frozen and silent over his partner's empty desk. I remembered the way the room went still, the way several Veil officials looked at me with open alarm, certain I had committed some grave violation. But Corin had not pulled away. He had stood there, rigid at first, and then, slowly, his shoulders had dropped, and something in his breathing had changed. Later that week, he sought me out privately and asked, in halting words he clearly found difficult to shape, what that feeling had been, the one that came after the strange embrace. I told him it was called comfort, and that humans believed grief was easier to carry when it was shared rather than held alone. He had no equivalent word for it in his own language. He asked me to teach him the human word instead, and he used it carefully, like a child learning to hold something fragile. Vesa had been standing at the back of the archive hall that day. I had not noticed her watching until much later, when she mentioned the incident herself, asking questions about it during one of our regular briefings. "What made you certain that touching him was the correct response?" she had asked. "Are humans not taught the same restraint we are?" I told her the truth. I told her I was not certain at all, that I had simply acted on instinct, because leaving someone alone in pain when I could offer comfort instead felt wrong to me, rules or no rules. She had gone quiet after that, turning the idea over in her mind the way she turned over difficult treaty clauses, testing it from every angle before deciding whether to accept it. Over the following months, I noticed small changes in her. She began asking more questions about human customs that had nothing to do with diplomacy. She asked why humans hugged each other before difficult conversations. She asked why we sometimes laughed when we were nervous rather than afraid. She asked, once, very carefully, why humans seem to value vulnerability rather than hide it the way her people did. I told her that showing vulnerability, admitting fear or sadness or uncertainty, took a particular kind of courage, and that hiding those things away did not make a person stronger, only more alone. She had looked at me for a long moment after that, an expression on her face I did not fully understand until much later. It looked almost like longing. We reached the end of the service shaft, and Vesa pushed open a hatch that dropped us into a dim maintenance corridor lined with humming coolant pipes. She moved with quiet purpose, clearly familiar with every turn, and I followed close behind, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. "They will have alerted the lower levels by now," she said. "We cannot take the main corridor to the archive. There is a longer route through the old atmospheric processing wing. It will take 12 minutes instead of 4. 12 minutes felt like an eternity with a bomb on my ship, and unknown enforcers somewhere behind us, but I had no better option, so I nodded and followed her lead. As we moved through the dim, humming corridor, I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since her confession in my quarters. "Vesa, back in my room, before all of this started, You said there was something you needed to tell me, something you were afraid you would never get to say if you waited." She kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead, but I saw her throat move as she swallowed. "I did say that," she answered. "Do you still want to say it?" I asked. "Even now." She was quiet for several steps, the only sound the soft hum of machinery around us, and our footsteps against the metal floor. "Especially now," she finally said, "because now I understand something I did not fully understand before today. I understand that waiting for safety, for certainty, for the correct moment, approved by custom and protocol, is its own kind of danger. My people believed that controlling emotion made us strong. But watching you these 2 years, I have come to believe that naming what we feel, admitting it plainly, even when it frightens us, is the greater strength." We turned a corner into a wider passage, pipes running along the ceiling in thick metal bundles, red emergency lighting pulsing softly at intervals. "When this began," she continued, "when I first started tracking the maintenance logs and the movement records, searching for proof that something was wrong, I told myself I was simply doing my duty as a liaison, protecting the treaty and the partnership between our people. But somewhere in the last few hours, crawling through corridors, watching footage of your ship being tampered with, I realized my fear was not only about the treaty, it was about you, specifically you. The thought of that device detonating, of you being gone before I ever said what I needed to say, was unbearable to me in a way I have never experienced before. My heart pounded against my ribs, and this time it had nothing to do with the danger chasing us through the station. "Vesa," I started to say, but she held up a hand, not to silence me, but because she was not finished. "I do not have a word for this feeling in my own language," she said. "We do not name it, because we are taught not to feel it, or at least not to admit that we do. I have had to learn your words instead, borrowing them the way I once borrowed the word comfort for Corin, because your language has shapes for things mine does not, and the closest word I have found, the one that seems to fit what I feel when I think of you, is one I am both terrified and relieved to finally say aloud." She stopped walking, turning to face me fully in the dim red light of the corridor, her hands no longer shaking, steadied now by whatever resolve had settled into her during the telling. "I care for you," she said, "in a way that goes far beyond duty, beyond diplomacy, beyond anything my people have words for. I have cared for you for a long time, and I was too afraid to say it, because saying it meant admitting a weakness according to everything I was raised to believe. But today, watching that device attached to your ship, imagining a version of events where I never told you, I understood that silence was the true weakness, not the feeling itself. For a moment, standing there in that dim, humming corridor, with danger somewhere behind us and an unknown number of minutes left before either the bomb went off or her people's enforcers caught up to us, none of it mattered as much as the words she had just spoken. Before I could answer, before I could find the right words to match what she had just given me, a distant clang echoed through the passage behind us, followed by voices, closer than either of us wanted them to be. "They found the shaft entrance," Vesa said, her expression sharpening instantly back into alertness. "We need to move now." We ran. The atmospheric processing wing was a maze of catwalks suspended over enormous filtration tanks, the air thick with the mineral smell of recycled oxygen. Vesa moved ahead of me with practiced speed, and I followed, my lungs burning, my mind still half caught on the words she had just spoken and half focused on the very real possibility that we were about to be caught by people who did not want either of us reporting what we knew. Behind us, the voices grew louder, then split into two directions as our pursuers reached a junction and guessed wrong about which path we had taken. It bought us precious seconds. "Down here," Vesa said, pointing toward a narrow ladder bolted to the side of a tank the size of a small building. "It leads to a maintenance platform below the archive level. From there we can reach the terminal without passing through the main checkpoint." I climbed down first this time, testing each rung before trusting my full weight to it, then reached up to steady Vesa as she followed. Her hand found my shoulder briefly for balance, and even in the middle of a chase, even with danger pressing close on every side, The touch registered somewhere warm beneath the fear. We reached the bottom and found ourselves in a low, cramped platform lit by a single flickering light panel. A narrow door on the far side led, according to Vesa, directly into the lower archive. Before we could reach it, the door burst open from the other side. Two enforcers stood in the frame, tall even by Vale standards, wearing the dark gray uniforms of internal security. Neither of them looked surprised to see us. That told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly this had been planned. Liaison Vesa, the taller one said, his translated voice flat and formal despite the tension in his posture. You are instructed to surrender the data device and return to your quarters for questioning. Vesa did not move to comply. Instead, she stepped slightly in front of me, which struck me as both unnecessary and, in a strange way, deeply human of her. On whose authority? She asked. I reported credible evidence of sabotage against a diplomatic transport vessel 3 hours ago. That evidence was dismissed without proper review. I would like to know who exactly is instructing me to surrender it now. The enforcer's expression flickered, just slightly, enough that I caught it even without the decades of practice Vesa had reading her own people's faces. That is not information I am authorized to share, he said. Then I am not authorized to comply, Vesa answered. The second enforcer moved first, stepping forward with clear intent to physically take the device from her hands. I did not think. I simply reacted, stepping between them the same instinctive way I had stepped in to comfort Corin in the archive hall months earlier, the same way humans had been reacting to danger and fear and loyalty since long before we ever left our home planet. I am a registered diplomatic official under the current treaty, I said, keeping my voice steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. Any physical action taken against me or against Liaison Vesa in the course of reporting credible evidence of sabotage constitutes a treaty violation with consequences reaching far beyond this station. It was not entirely true. I did not actually know the exact wording of that clause, if it even existed, but I said it with enough confidence that the enforcers hesitated, exchanging a glance that told me they were not fully certain either. Humans do this, I realized in that moment, the same instinct I had used 100 times growing up, in classrooms and workplaces and every ordinary human negotiation. We bluff. We push forward with conviction even when we are not entirely sure of the ground beneath us, because sometimes conviction alone is enough to make someone else hesitate. It worked, for exactly as long as it needed to. Behind the enforcers, deeper in the archive corridor, an alarm began sounding, different from the one that had woken me earlier, sharper and more urgent. A voice crackled through the enforcer's own communication devices, too quiet for me to make out the words, but the effect was immediate. Both of them turned, distracted, and in that instant Vesa grabbed my arm and pulled me sideways through a side passage I had not even noticed was there. We ran again, this time with actual enforcers, somewhere behind us, instead of simply pursuing our trail. What was that alarm? I asked between breaths, as we sprinted down a narrow service corridor lined with old storage crates. I do not know, Vesa admitted, but whatever it is buying us time we did not have a moment ago. We reached a junction, and Vesa paused just long enough to check a small display panel built into the wall, her fingers moving fast across the controls. The lower archive terminal is 2 corridors ahead, she said. If we can reach it and upload the full evidence file to the station's emergency broadcast system, every department will receive it simultaneously. No single official will be able to suppress it or claim ignorance afterward. That sounded like exactly the kind of plan that could either save both our lives or get us killed trying to execute it, and I told her so. She managed something close to a smile despite everything. Then it is fortunate, she said, that I have spent 2 years learning from a species that does not let fear decide its actions. We reached the terminal room moments later, a small chamber lined with old data servers, humming quietly in the dim light. Vesa moved to the central console and began inserting the data device, her fingers flying across the interface with the same precision she brought to every treaty document I had ever watched her review. "This will take approximately 90 seconds, she said. "If they catch us before the upload completes, everything we have done will be for nothing." I positioned myself near the door, watching the corridor outside, every muscle tense, every second stretching longer than it should have. 60 seconds remaining, Vesa said quietly. Footsteps echoed somewhere down the corridor. Not the enforcers from before, from the sound of it, but more of them, moving with the coordinated pace of a search team closing in on a known location. 40 seconds, Vesa said, her voice tightening slightly. I stepped fully into the doorway, prepared to do whatever it took to buy her those last precious seconds, even if that meant standing between her and whoever came around that corner. 20 seconds. A figure appeared at the end of the corridor, tall, uniformed, moving fast. 10 seconds, Vesa said, and I heard something in her voice that had not been there before, something that sounded almost like hope. The figure broke into a run. 5 seconds. Upload complete, Vesa said, just as the enforcer reached the doorway and grabbed my arm to pull me back. But it was already too late for them to stop what had been set in motion. Somewhere across the station, on every terminal, in every department, on screens belonging to officials who had never wanted to believe a human liaison's love for their world could matter as much as it just had, the truth was already spreading. The enforcer's grip on my arm was firm, but he did not drag me away immediately. Instead, he froze, his eyes flicking toward a small display panel mounted on the terminal room wall, where the emergency broadcast Vesa had just triggered was already playing across every screen on the station. I watched his expression change in real time. Confusion first, then something closer to alarm, and finally a kind of stunned stillness as the recorded evidence rolled across the display, showing timestamps, maintenance logs, and a clear image of a figure attaching a small device to the underside of my transport ship. He released my arm. "That is Elder Senate's personal aide," he said quietly, almost to himself, staring at the frozen image on the screen. Vesa stepped forward from the terminal, her posture straighter than I had seen it since this entire ordeal began. "Elder Senate has opposed the treaty renewal since its first draft," she said. "He has argued publicly, many times, that closeness with humans threatens the discipline our people have built over generations. I suspected him from the moment I found the tampering, but suspicion is not proof. Now the entire station has proof." The enforcer looked between us, clearly recalculating everything he had been ordered to do in the last few minutes. Whatever authority had sent him after us was suddenly standing on very different ground now that half the station had likely seen the same broadcast. "I was not given full information," he finally admitted. "I was told a device was stolen from a research lab and that the individuals carrying it were dangerous. That was a lie your superiors used to justify chasing us down before the truth came out," I said, my voice steadier than I expected given how hard my heart was still pounding. He did not argue the point. Instead, he touched the communication device at his collar and spoke quietly into it, requesting immediate verification from Station Command regarding the broadcast now playing across every screen. While he did that, Vesa turned to me, and for the first time since the alarms first sounded, I saw something like relief pass through her expression. "The evidence is out," she said, "but the device on your ship is still active. Broadcasting the truth does not disarm a bomb." "Right," I said, my mind already racing toward the next problem. "How long until my ship's scheduled departure?" She checked the small display built into her wrist communicator. 2 hours and 11 minutes, she said. "If the timing mechanism is tied to the departure sequence as I originally suspected, the device will detonate the moment the docking clamps release, regardless of what has happened here. Then we need bomb disposal," I said. "Immediately." The enforcer, still listening to his own communication device, held up a hand. "Command confirms the broadcast is authentic," he said, sounding almost dazed by his own words. "Elder Senate has been placed under formal restriction pending investigation. Full station security has been notified of the device on the transport vessel." That was good news, But it did not solve the actual problem sitting under my ship, ticking down toward zero. "Can your bomb disposal teams reach it in time?" I asked. "Standard protocol requires a full safety perimeter and a specialized disposal unit," he said. "Given the complexity of a device designed by someone with access to sensitive technical schematics, that process could take considerably longer than 2 hours." I felt the walls closing in around that number. 2 hours was not enough time for careful, methodical protocol. It might be enough time for something faster, something messier, something distinctly human in its willingness to act before every variable had been perfectly accounted for. "I need to see the device myself," I said. Vessa's head turned toward me sharply. "Absolutely not," she said. "You are not a disposal specialist." "No," I agreed, "but I spent 3 years working structural engineering before I became a diplomat, and if this device is attached to the hull the way you described, there may be a way to separate it from the ship's fuel systems without waiting for a full protocol team to assemble." "That is an enormous risk," Vessa said, her voice tightening again the way it had when she first walked through my door hours earlier. "It is a risk either way," I said. "Waiting for the perfect procedure while the clock runs out is also a risk. I would rather take the version of that risk where I am doing something instead of standing here hoping someone else solves it in time." She stared at me for a long moment, and something in her expression told me she recognized this pattern too well by now. The same instinct that had made me hug a grieving man in defiance of custom. The same instinct that had made me bluff my way past 2 enforcers without any real legal authority behind my words. She had spent 2 years watching humans act first and calculate consequences second, and somewhere in that time she had stopped being only unsettled by it. "Then I am coming with you," she said. We reached the docking bay 18 minutes later, moving fast through corridors now filled with station personnel murmuring about the broadcast, about Elder Senate, about a human liaison, and a Vale official who had apparently uncovered a conspiracy together. Word travels fast on a station that size, faster still when the news involves both danger and unlikely partnership. The transport ship sat exactly where I had left it, its hull gleaming under the docking bay's harsh work lights, utterly unaware of the small deadly object clinging to its underside. A small team of technicians had already gathered nearby, kept back by a hastily assembled safety perimeter, arguing quietly among themselves about procedure and risk tolerance. "I do not have time to argue with committee," I muttered, walking straight past the perimeter line before anyone could stop me. Vessa followed immediately, and behind us I heard the enforcer who had chased us earlier calling out something about authorization, though he made no real effort to physically stop either of us. Perhaps the broadcast had changed his calculations about which side of this situation he wanted to be standing on. Up close, the device was smaller than I expected, a flat, dark rectangle magnetically clamped to a maintenance panel just beside the primary fuel coupling. A thin cable ran from it directly into the ship's departure timing system, exactly as Vessa had described. "If I disconnect the cable without disarming the main unit first," one of the technicians called out from the perimeter, his voice tight with warning, "it may trigger immediately rather than waiting for the scheduled detonation." I studied the housing of the device for a long moment, my engineering training pulling old memories forward from years before I had ever set foot on this station. The casing was standard alloy, nothing exotic, nothing beyond basic containment design. Whoever built this had prioritized reliability over sophistication, which meant it likely used a straightforward power source rather than anything self-sustaining. "If it draws power from the ship's own systems rather than an internal battery," I said, thinking out loud, "then cutting the ship's auxiliary power to that specific panel should disable it without triggering the detonation sequence, because the timing mechanism itself would lose power at the same moment." "That is an assumption," Vessa said quietly beside me, not with fear this time, but with the sharp, careful tone she used when reviewing treaty language for hidden risk. "It is an educated one," I said, "but you are right that it is still a guess." "We do not have time for anything better than an educated guess," she said, and to my surprise it was not a warning, but something closer to agreement. I found the auxiliary power conduit exactly where 2 years of studying this ship's design during my posting told me it would be, tucked behind a small access panel a few feet from the device itself. My hands were steadier than I expected as I pried the panel open, though my heart was doing anything but steady work inside my chest. Vesa crouched beside me, watching every movement with total focus. "If you are wrong about this," she said quietly, "there will not be a version of this station where either of us gets to have the conversation we still need to finish." I glanced at her, allowing myself one brief second of something other than pure focus. "Then I suppose I had better be right," I said. I disconnected the auxiliary conduit. For a heartbeat, absolutely nothing happened, and in that heartbeat I became fully convinced I had guessed wrong, and that the next sound I heard would be the last one either of us ever experienced. Then the small indicator light on the device blinked once, twice, and finally went dark, its connection to the timing system severed exactly as I had hoped. Somewhere behind us, one of the technicians let out a breath so loud it was almost a shout of relief. Vesa did not say anything at all. She simply reached over and took my hand, holding it tightly enough that I felt the tremor finally leaving her fingers. "The device is confirmed inactive," one of the disposal technicians called out. "Readings show 0 charge across all monitored systems. Someone please get a proper containment team down here to remove it safely." I sat back against the cold floor of the docking bay, adrenaline still pouring through my system, staring up at the ship that had almost taken everything from both of us. 2 hours ago, I had been folding shirts into a travel case, thinking about nothing more complicated than saying goodbye. Now I was sitting on the floor of a docking bay, having just disarmed an explosive device with a guess built on old engineering training, and a stubborn refusal to wait for permission. Vesa sat down beside me, still holding my hand, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. Around us, station personnel began the slow work of securing the area, questioning technicians, confirming the broadcast, and quietly, cautiously, beginning to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the species that had arrived among them 2 years earlier. "You did not answer me earlier," Vesa finally said, her voice quieter now, stripped of the urgency that had carried it through the last several hours. "Answer what?" I asked. "Whether you still intend to leave," she said, nodding toward the ship beside us, the ship that in less than 2 hours was still technically scheduled to carry me away from this station and everyone on it, including her. I looked at the ship, then at her, and realized that somewhere during the last 2 hours, crawling through service shafts and disarming a bomb with nothing but old memories and stubborn conviction, the answer had already become obvious to me, even if I had not said it aloud yet. "I do not think I ever intended to leave," I said. "Not really. I think some part of me knew that the moment you knocked on my door." Vesa turned to look at me fully, and for the first time since I had known her, I watched an expression cross her face that her own culture had no name for, something between disbelief and a kind of quiet, overwhelming relief. "Your assignment here is complete," she said carefully, as though testing whether the fact itself might change my answer. "Your government expects your return. There will be questions if you remain without proper authorization." "Let them ask questions," I said. "I would rather answer difficult questions on this station, beside you, than fly home to easy ones that leave me wondering what I gave up by leaving too soon." Before either of us could say more, a formal chime sounded across the docking bay, followed by an announcement requesting that Liaison Vesa and the human diplomatic representative report immediately to the Central Council chamber. My stomach tightened at the word immediately, though I reminded myself that whatever waited in that chamber could not possibly be worse than the last several hours we had already survived. The council chamber sat at the heart of the station, a wide circular room lined with tiered seating occupied by elders and officials from every major department of Vale governance. I had stood in that room only twice before during my posting, both times for formal treaty proceedings that had felt distant and ceremonial. This time felt entirely different, charged with an energy I had never experienced within those walls. Elder Wren, the presiding official who had overseen most of my original treaty negotiations, stood at the center platform as we entered. Her expression, usually carefully neutral, carried something sharper today, something that looked almost like anger, though I could not yet tell whether it was directed at us or at the situation we had uncovered. "Liaison Vesa," she said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. "You will explain to this council exactly how you came to possess evidence of a plot against our treaty partner's transport vessel, and why that evidence was first dismissed by your reporting officer 3 hours before you were forced to act independently." Vesa stepped forward, and I watched her transform in front of the entire council, the fear and urgency of the last several hours folding away into the same measured, precise diplomat I had first met 2 years earlier, though something steadier now lived underneath that composure. "I discovered irregularities in the docking bay maintenance logs during a routine review," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "When I reported those irregularities through standard channels, they were dismissed as emotional overreaction, a phrase used specifically because my initial concern was expressed with what my reporting officer considered excessive urgency." A murmur passed through the tiered seating. Elder Wren's expression did not soften, but she did not interrupt either. "I chose to investigate further on my own authority," Vesa continued, "because I believed, correctly, that a serious threat was being ignored due to prejudice against the manner in which I expressed my concern, rather than the substance of the concern itself. I gathered conclusive evidence, confirmed the identity of the individual responsible, and when I was pursued by enforcers attempting to suppress that evidence before it could reach proper review, I made the decision to broadcast it directly to this council and to every department on this station simultaneously." Elder Wren was quiet for a long moment, studying Vesa with an expression I could not fully read. "You broke 6 separate procedural regulations in the process," she finally said. "Yes," Vesa answered without hesitation. "I did. And you would do so again, given the same circumstances?" Elder Wren asked. Vesa did not glance at me, though I felt the weight of the question settle over both of us equally. "Yes," she said, "because the alternative was allowing a bomb to detonate on a diplomatic transport vessel while officials debated whether my concern had been expressed with sufficient composure to warrant their attention." The chamber fell into a heavier silence after that, and I found myself holding my breath, uncertain whether Vesa had just secured her position within Vale governance or ended it entirely. Elder Wren turned to address the full council. "This body has spent 3 years debating whether closeness with the human species represents contamination of our discipline, as Elder Senate and his faction have long argued, or whether it represents something our people genuinely lack. Today, one of our own liaisons ignored every instinct toward restraint that our culture instilled in her since childhood, acted with what many in this chamber would once have called dangerous urgency, and in doing so, saved a diplomatic vessel and uncovered a conspiracy that would have caused irreparable harm to this treaty and to innocent lives." She paused, letting the words settle across the chamber. "I confess," she continued, "that I do not yet know what to make of this. My instincts, trained over decades, tell me that Liaison Vesa's actions represent exactly the kind of undisciplined urgency our culture has always sought to prevent. And yet the outcome of that urgency was the only reason any of us are alive to debate the matter at all." She turned back to Vesa directly. "Perhaps," Elder Wren said, more quietly now, "discipline without the courage to act when circumstances demand it is not truly the strength we have always believed it to be." I felt something in the room shift, subtle but unmistakable, a decades-old assumption bending slightly under the weight of what had just happened. "This council will conduct a full investigation into Elder Senate's actions," Elder Wren continued, her voice returning to its formal cadence. "Liaison Vesa's procedural violations will be reviewed in light of the circumstances that necessitated them, and the treaty renewal vote scheduled for tomorrow will proceed as planned, given that the primary source of opposition to it has just been revealed as the architect of an attempted act of sabotage rather than a principled objector." A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the tiered seating, though whether it reflected relief, discomfort, or simple shock, I could not entirely tell. Elder Wren's attention shifted finally toward me, and I straightened instinctively under the weight of her gaze. "And you, human liaison," she said, "I understand you personally disarmed the device rather than waiting for a proper disposal team." "I did," I confirmed. "Why?" she asked, and the question carried genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "Because waiting felt like accepting a version of events where the ship might explode before help arrived," I said, "and because 2 years on this station taught me that sometimes the most disciplined choice is not the safest one, but the one that refuses to let fear make the decision instead of judgment." Elder Wren studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression, though still guarded by generations of cultural restraint, softened almost imperceptibly. "Your species arrived among us 2 years ago, and many of us believed you would teach us nothing beyond the dangers of uncontrolled emotion," she said. "I begin to wonder whether we have instead been offered a lesson in the difference between control and courage, one we did not know we needed until circumstances forced us to see it." The council session ended shortly after, with formal instructions for Vessa's procedural review and a directive that both of our accounts be recorded in full detail for the treaty archives. As we left the chamber, the weight of the last several hours finally began settling over me, exhaustion creeping into muscles that had been running on pure adrenaline since the first alarm sounded that morning. We walked back through the station in near silence, past personnel who now looked at us with open curiosity rather than the polite distance I had grown used to over 2 years. Word of everything that had happened, the sabotage, the broadcast, the disarmed device, and somewhere within all of it, the quiet fact that a human liaison and a Vale official had chosen each other over protocol, had clearly spread through every level of the station by now. We reached the observation deck overlooking the docking bay, the same wide window where I had once watched my first Vale sunrise 2 years earlier, uncertain whether I would ever adjust to a world so different from my own. The transport ship still sat below, its earlier danger now reduced to a memory and a stack of official reports. "My original orders still require me to return home eventually," I said, watching the ship rather than her, though not necessarily on today's schedule. Vessa stepped up beside me at the window, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. "I do not want you to leave," she said simply, without the hesitation that had characterized every version of this conversation up until now. "Not today, and not because of any schedule that was never designed with either of us in mind." I turned to face her fully. "Then I will request an extension of my posting," I said. "And if that request is denied, I will find another way to stay, because I have spent 2 years watching your people slowly learn that emotion is not a weakness, and I find that I am not ready to walk away from the person who taught me that discipline, without heart, is not truly strength either." She reached for my hand again, the same steady grip from the docking bay, though without any tremor left in it now. "Earlier, in your quarters, before any of this began," she said, "I told you there was something I needed to say before you left. I believe I have said it now more than once, in more than one way." "You have," I said. "But I want to say one more thing," she continued, and this time her voice carried none of the fear that had haunted it that morning. "Whatever happens next, whatever this council decides about procedure and protocol and the future of our two peoples, I am glad the words finally left me before I lost the chance to say them. I do not know if my people have a word yet for what I feel toward you, but I have decided I no longer need one. I only need you to know that it is real, and that I chose to say it rather than let silence decide for me." Outside the window, the station's artificial daylight cycle was shifting toward its gentle evening tones, casting long amber light across the docking bay, where, only hours earlier, a hidden device had nearly ended everything before it truly began. I thought about the 2 years that had brought me here, about Corin learning the word comfort in a quiet archive hall, about every small, unguarded human moment that had slowly reshaped how an entire culture understood strength. I thought about how humanity had arrived among the stars carrying a reputation for recklessness, for uncontrolled feeling, for a kind of chaos other species viewed with wary curiosity. And I thought about how that same reckless, uncontrolled, deeply human refusal to stay silent, to wait for perfect procedure, to hide fear instead of naming it, had just saved a ship, exposed a conspiracy, and given a woman raised to fear her own heart the courage to finally speak it aloud. Perhaps that was the truest thing humanity had brought to the galaxy. Not our ships, not our technology, not even our stubborn persistence in the face of danger. Simply the willingness to feel something fully and say it out loud before the chance to say it disappeared forever. I looked at Vesa, standing beside me in the amber evening light, her hand still steady in mine, and I understood that whatever came next, whatever the council decided, whatever new dangers or difficulties waited ahead for two people from two very different worlds choosing to stand together, I would rather face all of it with her than return home to the safety of never having asked the question at all. So I asked it anyway. "Can I tell you something too, before either of us has to think about leaving again?" I said. Vesa smiled, fully this time, without hesitation, without the careful restraint her culture had spent generations building into her. "I would like that very much," she said. And so, standing together at the edge of a station that had almost witnessed a tragedy that morning, we began the far better story of everything that came after.